Hello, I'm Tom Geary. My presentation today is an introduction to the pros and cons of tropical restoration and reforestation. I came to this because I became alarmed about global warming. And that started me thinking about the role of trees and forests in solving the problem. And that led me to read a book written by Bill Gates, co-founder of Microsoft Corporation. In his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need, I had hoped to find out how trees would be part of the solution. Gates is not enthusiastic about trees as a solution, exclamation point. Building on my personal experience in search of the literature, I side with Gates. And I'm going to tell you what I think and why I think it. As caveats, I am speaking about trees whose main purpose is carbon storage, and I am accepting a Gates view that we need to reduce greenhouse gases emissions to zero until the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere returns to that of the pre-industrial area. That is emissions to zero. I believe I'm qualified to talk on this subject. I've done research on tree planting for commercial wood production and biomass energy. I've done research on controlling invasive tree species. I work with the US government in technical assistance and research cooperation with other countries. And most of this experience was in the tropics. The book by Bill Gates is challenging the useful of tree planting and forest to mitigate climate change. And the title of his book, the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need. And I just pointed out Gates is co-founder of Microsoft Corporation. In this case, you're wondering who he was. That doesn't really make him authority on the subject, but I think he's pretty good. And Gates is not optimistic about trees as one of the solutions. And again, Gates' goal to avoid a disaster is reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to the level of the pre-industrial era. Now, the question is, what I've read is, does it apply to tropical restoration and reforestation? This book is about the problem of global warming, but the tropics are linked to that. They're, in fact, a major component of why the globe is warming. Gates does not include planting trees for aesthetic and other environmental benefits in his skepticism. Those living in the tropics can decide if his views fit their situation. I mean, look out your window and see if it's what he's saying actually applies to you. But I do think concerns Gates raises of tree survival and forest preservation apply to most regions and tree uses. An exception may be industrial wood plantations. Now, here's some points I'm going to cover. Well, accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere forces global warming. I think we can say it's highly probable that is a true statement. However, I would do as an aside. There are natural forces that are also at play, and it's unsettled how much they contribute to warming. We are in an interglacial period of the Ice Age, and warming, sea level rise, and glacial retreat is going on for several thousand years, but it's not been a straight linear increase. There have been long periods of higher level quickening of warming, and then there have been some pretty extensive cooling periods. And the question is now, which way is the switch? Is it on for warming or cooling? And I think just leave that discussion to physicists to work out. Trees take carbon dioxide, a major greenhouse gas, out of the atmosphere and store the carbon. We know that's absolutely true. Tree planting seems a good idea for removing carbon dioxide, but has problems. Natural regeneration often seems a better option, but also has problems. Preserving the existing store of carbon in existing forests is ideal, but will be difficult. Now let's look at tree planting according to Gates. Planting trees to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is cheap and low tech. It has appeal, but the effect in global warming is overblown. That's what he says. He says the effect is overblown. And he gives an example that's really related to how much carbon can the forest store. US example, 20 hectares of highly productive land is needed to absorb the emissions of an average American in their lifetime. And if you multiply by the number of Americans, you're using half of the world's land mass. Big caveat here, trees planted for carbon storage must survive for a long time. If trees would grow naturally in planting areas, no extra carbon storage is needed. I'm not going to talk about direct seeding for restoration. I think the survival problem is there, but I understand that there's research going on and advances that may get around some of those problems, but it's still a challenge. Now, here's some of the problematic stuff. It is one thing to plant a tree and another have the tree survive to fulfill the proposed function. And I would say that's worth repeating. It is one thing to plant a tree and another to have the tree survive to the proposed function. One credit card company will plant a tree to cover your carbon footprints every time you use the card. That's a feel-good thing to do. But will the tree survive to fulfill the promise? The promoted option is purchasing planted trees or existing forests as carbon emission offsets. But will the trees and forest survive? If not, can the carbon credit be canceled and the purchasers get their money back? In other words, what is the guarantee and who is policing this? And unfortunately, a little more negative on tree planting. I know of large-scale tree plantings that failed. And one good reason is people were paid to plant trees but not keep them alive. And another was planting was done in the wrong place for the wrong reason. And I think really the more of the point is there's a recent publication by Forrest Fleischman and 14 others is negative, like Gates. The publication's title is Pitfalls of Tree Planting Show Why We Need People-Centered Natural Solutions. And well, Fleischman's pitfalls. They list 11, that is 11 in detail, and we have to get the publication to go into what they are. The bottom line is they believe that policymakers are convinced that massive campaign plant trees should be an element of global climate policy. But they said the benefits are emphasized, but the pitfalls are downplayed. They say avoid the expense, risk, and damage of poorly designed and hastily implemented tree planting and impose that on ecosystems and people. Let's look at natural regeneration. Natural regeneration to produce a carbon storage forest seems a great idea. Let nature take its course and reestablish forests. Gates favors it over tree planting. And I have wondered many times why trees are being planted on deforested land when natural regeneration would do it. And here's some things in favor of natural regeneration. There were good examples, at least. In the eastern part of the United States, this was completely deforested. Now it is heavily forested, mainly by natural regeneration. And a recent report on the study of planting trees on abandoned farmland in the US state of Maryland, an unexpected result. The trees growing the best came up from rootstocks and seeds that are in the soil. So natural regeneration is cheaper than planting and uses less fossil fuels in establishment. And I think that's important. People really have to consider when they're doing the project how much fossil fuel they're using. We're trying to eliminate using fossil fuels. Now, the con of natural regeneration, that basically it's a difficulty in preserving the regrown forest. Young trees are easier to cut down than old forests. Second growth forests in the Amazon typically only last 5 to 8 years. In Costa Rica, reforestation. Okay, the difficulty of preserving the regrown forest. Young forests easy to cut down the old forest. Second growth forest in the Amazon typically lasts only 5 to 8 years. In Costa Rica, a reforestation champion, half of regrown forests fall within 20 years. Basically, regenerating forests being the same peril as established forests. Well, let's look at preserving existing forests for carbon capture. Gates says the most effective tree-related strategy is preserve the trees we already have. And why? Well, good example. Environmental Defense Fund report. Tropical deforestation contributes 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the greatest forest problem really is protecting existing forests. And here are some of the woes. There's a few examples, not necessarily all related to the tropics, but the tropical forests are being felled for agriculture at a rapid pace. And one thing is 3 billion more people will have by the end of the century, and this is going to increase loss, particularly for agricultural land. And massive fires in temperate forests are really news. Here in the US, we have native and alien pests killing many trees. So how to deal with all these problems? Gates does go through breakthroughs needed. One, he says the cost of clean energy, electric power storage, and carbon capture must be reduced to compete with fossil fuels. In other words, to get to zero emissions. And he says the current technology is not sufficient to get to zero emissions. Gates lists 19 technologies needed, and no forestry technologies are directly stated. And end note is hope these thoughts are fuel for heated discussion, but this is not exactly the end note one will bring to you. If you're interested in the references I use, you can look in the report by Thomas Geary in the ISTF newsletter for April 22. This presentation is based on that report. And you might add the paper by Asner in called Measuring Carbon Emissions for Tropical Deforestation and Overview. It's an Environmental Defense Fund report, and I think you should be able to find it by just going to the edf.org website. Well, thank you very much.